this is, I'm just going to give you 5 minutes of background on what got us here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lester King, and I'll introduce him at that point. But I took over the Shell Center actually as academic director about a little over 2 years ago, and about that time there was a Jim Blackburn, who's sitting on the front row here, was in the process of completing a class project that the Shell Center had funded on sustainability indicators for Houston. And so Jim came over, presented that. There was a document that was published on our center website, the outcome of that. And this was a project that involved, I think, roughly maybe 50 students, Jim, that looked at various indicators for how we measure indicators. For those that are not familiar with it, because it was new to me when I took over, are just different ways of sort of measuring how the city is doing in terms of how we're progressing to maintaining a sustainable future for this city. There's certainly more elaborate ways, and I'm sure we'll get into more elaborate definitions, but that's generally what we're talking about here is where is this city going to be in 25, 50 years from now? And how do we measure that, and what should the indicators be that we measure to tell us how we're progressing, how we're doing on air quality, water, transportation, a whole variety of things. It became very obvious to me from the onset that this is a very complicated issue. I thought it was very simple. That's how naive I was, but when I began to realize how all these things intermesh, transportation, food, air quality, poverty, all these things begin to interconnect. For somebody who's had a little experience of doing numerical modeling of ice sheets, I found this to be far more challenging because it was very difficult to know what we should be measuring, how we should measure it, and that sort of thing. So we felt from the onset that we wanted to get more engaged in this. Jim's report definitely was what brought that message home to us. So when that project was completed, we felt the next step was to bring in someone who was actually trained in the field of sustainability, because by then those of us like myself who were naive enough to think that we could just figure it out on our own had learned that wasn't going to happen, and that we needed to bring in somebody who actually had been trained in the field of sustainability. And so we brought in Dr. Lester King here, who has his PhD in sustainability. And Lester's challenge was to take basically what Jim and his class had generated and try to take it to the next level. Weren't really sure what the next level was at that point, but we did feel that there was a need to try to start to bring in different groups that deal with these issues of sustainability indicators, and to try to develop some consensus. We were just talking here about consensus, and consensus is a really tough thing when you bring in experts and you try to get them to agree on things. What should we measure? How do we measure it? Why is it important? And that process alone, believe me, is a real learning process. It really is necessary to go through. Now, I've attended more than a couple of workshops and read more than the results of the workshops in places like Atlanta, for example, that have looked at the indicators issue and what's typically done there, and some of these are funded by National Academy of Science even. What's typically done is you bring in experts, they speak to the community, they get on a plane, they go home. There's a report that's usually a tome of 100, 200 pages that probably not many people read, that gets generated, and that seems to be about the end of the show. And we wanted to go beyond that. We wanted to actually try to do a series of workshops that would bring together the experts in the various disciplines, looking at the social issues, looking at the economic issues, the environmental issues, and try to gain some consensus on what the important indicators were, how they should be measured, monitored over the years, and what our next step should be. So that's why we're here. We held these workshops this semester over the past couple of months, and they were rather lively sessions, some more lively than others. And now we want to report to you what came so that's the reason for being here today. I also want to acknowledge that the co-sponsors of this particular gathering are the Kinder Institute and the Speed Center, both of whom we work very closely with, and both of whom have representatives either on our operating committee or we have representatives on their operating committees. And so there's a close working relationship there. One of the nice things about Rice is it's not a big place. We can get across campus pretty easily. Also wanted to thank the partners in today's, for sponsoring today's meeting, the Center for Houston's Future, the Houston Museum of Natural Science, and the Citizens Environmental Coalition. I also want to thank those people, there are some of those folks here who participated in these workshops. They gave a day of their time, and we greatly appreciate that. Many of them couldn't be here today. Some will be here later, but I'm sure the names will come up, and we all appreciate their contributions. So without going any further, I promise I'll try to keep it to 5 minutes. I think I've already gone over. He knew 10 minutes probably. The Anderson factor and being added in. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Lester King, who's going to tell you more about what we're going to do today. And he's going to moderate the first part of the session, and then Jim's going to moderate, as I understand, the second part.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Lester King. Thank you, John, for the introduction. John has me the primary advisor on this project. He's also the director for the Shell Center for Sustainability, and couldn't have asked for a better advisor on this project. Let me just jump right into the presentation here because of time. So I was presented with 4 objectives to the project. These objectives were to prioritize the big issues that kind of affect us in Houston, the kind of things that we can talk about at our dinner tables, and the same things that we're actually dealing with at the city level in terms of decision makers and appointed officials. You know, what are those issues, and how do they affect, or how are they affected by sustainability? Also asked to consider indicator interrelatedness. How do the Department of Transportation, how do they work with the EPA at the federal level? How does that work with HUD? And then is there a local complement to that? Do we have these same kind of interrelationships going on at the local level in Houston? So what does that mean for sustainability? The third objective was to deliver something that's spatial, that folks can see what's going on in the city, and they can actually identify how these types of things actually affect them at home. And that worked, of course. And the fourth component was education, in terms of getting the message out to Houston and to elected officials and, again, decision makers to offer some support to what the wonderful efforts already going on at the city level. So those were my objectives that I was given by my advisory committee. And I kind of like to illustrate what that means with these 4 boxes. 4 nice points generates a lot of interest and a lot of activity. This is something that I'm very passionate about. I'm passionate about Houston. I'm passionate about sustainable development. For me, it was an opportunity to, show what I think contemporary knowledge and analytical support can do with understanding sustainability in a wonderful city like Houston. So we're talking about big ideas. We're talking about the challenge of, first of all, identifying what indicators are the ideal indicators. Some of you may or may not know, but there are thousands and thousands of indicators out there today. So how do you decide which ones to choose for Houston? Shouldn't you choose all of them, or at least see how all of them might affect the city? Well, a lot of you might know that that's going to be a tremendously restricted task, right? That's one of those rational types of efforts that we know can't possibly work. So you might want to take a more incremental approach. But that's not what we're doing here. This is kind of exploratory research. So how can you, again, decide which ones to choose from the thousands and thousands? At some point you're going to be leaving things out. So there's that dilemma to be decided on. The second one is we're talking about something that's interdisciplinary, right? We're talking about geology meeting social sciences meeting engineering, and who's going to be able to manage those different types of concerns in an informative way, and in a way that's robust and valid for all the third component is the measurement issues, right? So we have a situation where some things have to be measured, some things have to be measured spatially, some things have to only be measured by data in terms of information, numbers, some things. We're talking about a tremendously cross-disciplinary process again. You know, what kind of software can handle these things? We have different programs, different software. You know, we don't talk to somebody in another field because a lot of times we don't have the same language to use. So that's an issue. Then we have issues of scale. We talked about Houston. This morning, 30 minutes ago I heard Andrew Schneider on the radio talking about how the Houston area has shown great improvements in jobs. And we're second to New York and ahead of Chicago. And again, some of you may or may not know that when you talk about the Houston area, there's no institution that has a defined border for the Houston area. What we have is the city of Houston, we have the Houston Metropolitan Statistical Area, we have the HGAC region, which is 13 counties. The MSA is about 8 or 9 counties, right? We have the regional water district, which is another region. We have the air quality district. And these are all different issues that, you know, when we're talking about Houston, the question is, what are we going to be referring to? So this study refers to the city of Houston, because we don't want to get lost in these types of scale issues. Then there's the issue of reporting. How do you amass all this data and then give it to a decision maker to actually be able to do anything about it? How does he prioritize how he's going to respond? How do you give that same information to a citizen who knows nothing about sustainability, but they know that they want a good life for themselves and a good life for their family? How do you give that same data to a decision maker who will call you out on the analysis? And they already have structures in place which you are possibly going to be challenging based on the fact that you're bringing something new. So it has to be this amazingly cross-platform type effort. This is the advisory panel that I was given to inform the research. And as you can see, most of these stalwarts have 30 years of experience or so, right? When John starts to talk about things that he did in the early 70s, I can only shake my head because it's wonderful being advised with experience, but it's kind of, you know, makes me feel small and also privileged that you're able to learn from these great, again, stalwarts in Houston. So I have here a geologist, an environmental lawyer, I have a sociologist, political scientist, and an economist that advise this study. We thought it best to also convene panels of experts according to the 3 pillars of sustainability. Again, to reflect this kind of multidisciplinary cross-platform issue that sustainability brings to the table, the balance of the social development, economic development, and environmental development. And so you can see here that we've had a nice cross-section of representation from across different agencies in the city. We had the City of Houston Planning Director, we had Peter Brown, former City Council member, and we had the Dean of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University. We had the Chief Executive Officer for Metro, George Grenius. We had Laura Spangian, Houston Sustainability Director. We had Jim Chang from the City of Houston Public Works, Deputy Director for Water Planning. We had Aston Hines, the Environmental Director for Port of Houston, Brian Manchin from the Sierra Club, and a few others. We had about 24 or so approximate experts convened to, again, discuss the indicators and policy that might possibly come out from that effort. This is the model that I presented to the advisory in terms of how I was going to approach this project. What I want you to keep in mind is the 3 different color tracks that follow in this diagram. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see this green in the back? Okay, wonderful. So this tan color was the choice of identifying the big issues, of course, at the top, determining the choice of indicators, getting to the consensus building with experts, looking at targets, which we'll talk about in a second, and then developing policy and prioritization of issues. So this is kind of the expert track. This track in the center is the desktop approach. That's what I, as the analyst, did from behind the computer and other ways. And then this third track on the right is involving citizens in the research. And together at the bottom, we'll come up with the Houston Sustainability Indicators Database, and of course, a policy that flows from that. Here's a list of the indicators that I came up with, and I'm sure you can't see this in the back. As I go through the presentation, it'll become more clear. I'm more familiar to you guys. I'll leave it up for a second because I know a lot of you are interested in what the indicators are. So we have different ways in which we can organize indicators. Three kind of biggest ways to do that would be kind of the goal indicators type approach, which is the decision-making body sets their goals, and then they determine what indicators they're going to use to measure those goals. It's a wonderful effort, but the strength of that effort is based on the goals. And we are not a decision-making body here at Rice. We're offering research to the Houston community. We're not in a position to take advantage of that type of effort. The second type of effort would be one a little bit more complicated, mainly for analysts, called the state response, the pressure state response type system. And in that one, you kind of identify what the pressures are in society. You measure the state of things, and then you determine what will be the appropriate response. And in some cases, you can also come up with an indicator to measure that response. It's a little bit analytical. Again, as I said, it's for these analysts more so than anybody else. The third approach that I used was this theme, sub-theme, indicator approach. The reason I chose this one is because we are a large city. John mentioned this National Academy of Sciences report that we were a part of in the early part of the year. And this report will come out soon. One of the things that came out of that report is that we are not operating as a cohesive unit in Houston in terms of pursuing policy towards sustainable development. So I wanted to capture as many themes, as many moving points and targets as I could. The kind of things, again, that people talk about. And so I used this theme, sub-theme, indicator, metric kind of approach to be able to capture, again, as many things as possible. Because at the end of all of this, we want to get to policy suggestions and program types of suggestions. And so we're going to develop indicators to be able to address policy. This is an instrument I used to help to organize decision-making among the experts. And so basically it was a Delphi type survey. I sent out the survey to these experts by email, and I collated the responses. Then we met for a 4-hour stretch, 3 different 4-hour stretches. And at the end of that, after that wonderful exercise, we did the same survey again. So it was an opportunity for experts to hear other experts and hopefully be able to challenge their more fundamental perspectives and to possibly kind of evoke change. And so I got a little bit of that coming out of this survey as well with the experts. So that's kind of how the experts were organized. So here is the classification for the social indicators. One of the things I wanted to do with, I can't move around, excuse me, I have to stay here, even though I want to. One of the things I wanted to do with these indicators is to balance between indicators of social development, indicators of economic development, and indicators of environmental development. So I tried to balance, again, those indicators to help meet this fundamental principle that the difference between sustainability information and historical way of doing things is the integration of environmental indicators. Because as you may or may not know, in the past, we've only really concentrated on socioeconomic types of indicators. And so if you introduce environmental indicators, there is this principle of balance that should be considered. So here is the social indicators, and you might also see, I'm sorry, let me take a step back here. You might also see these 3 icons on the right. That's for the average person to readily identify something that they can follow throughout the report and throughout the indicators project. 3 different icons. A green icon meaning we have a good trend going in terms of sustainability. meaning Houston does. The amber trend, moderate trend, meaning, we have moderate action that needs to be taken. But it's a moderate trend. It's not bad, it's not great, it's moderate. And then the red, meaning we are on a negative trend, and major action is needed. The reason I say trend is because sometimes you might see graphs going up, sometimes going down. Just because it's going down doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And so we just call it a trend. And it's a negative trend. And major action needs to be taken. So here are the icons according to the social indicators that were chosen. I personally don't like the fact that we don't have any green icons. I also would like to think that we can work towards making these things green. This is an assessment over 30 years in Houston. We collected data starting at 1990, and we showed trends by 2000, intermediary years as well, and then on to 2010. And we show that we have more moderate to negative trends than green. And so we would like to come up with policies that can get us into the green trends. Here are a few. Let me take a couple minutes to begin by presenting to you the end, so that when I do get into the data, you understand where we're coming from. So here's kind of a few points on policy outtakes from those expert meetings. I will present the social development policy outtakes, the economic development policy outtakes. I'll hand the podium over to Jim Blackburn, who will present help me to co-moderate the environmental policy experts, and he'll present those policy outtakes from that workshop. So here are a few. We're talking about, for the sub-theme of population growth and the indicator population growth, we're talking about encouraging more population growth within the city through incentives, as opposed to development in the suburbs. For the sub-theme of education and the indicator education attainment, we need to reduce the education gap. We also need to develop vocational technology training, because all kids aren't destined for college. Some of them are definitely more capable of doing more tech-type jobs, and we want to also fundamentally improve their skills in that area. For the sub-theme of community involvement, we looked at the indicator of voter participation. We need to increase voting in Houston. And we need to demonstrate accountability to citizens, or rather, appointed officials need to demonstrate accountability to citizens. And we think, of course, the adoption of a comprehensive sustainability indicators program would help towards that effort. Under the theme of poverty, we looked at three sub-themes. We looked at inequality, poverty level, and healthcare delivery. Under the inequality sub-theme, we looked at the indicator of income inequality, and we found that improved skills and training, if that were developed, again, that would help to alleviate poverty. If folks can get the training that they are met, or that can meet their needs, they can then be able to probably improve job retention. We also looked at local or state taxing structure to reduce income inequality. Under the sub-theme poverty level, we looked at the indicator poverty rate, and we're talking about establishing a commission to root out the causes of poverty in the city, because the trend is increasing. Under the sub-theme of healthcare delivery, we looked at the indicator health coverage, and we think that since presently we have healthcare tied to jobs, if we were to attract more jobs that offer livable wages, we think that would improve the options of people to have access to healthcare. Under the theme of livability, also under the social development pillar and sustainability, we have three sub-themes. And they're cost of living, where we looked at the indicator affordability, and we recognize that Houston does have a lower than average cost of housing when compared to the average income, but we have a higher than average cost of transportation when compared to the average. And so improving transit options might help to reduce the percentage of cost of living, as a percentage of income in Houston. Under the sub-theme of quality of life, the indicator accessibility of public spaces, we know that Houston needs to aggressively develop more Under the health and nutrition subtheme, we looked at the indicator food deserts, and we came to the conclusion that we need to attract more grocery stores selling fresh fruits and vegetables in the city. That's the outcome from the social development side of things, and here are a few from the economic development side of things. We looked at two major strands of more major themes under economic development. We looked at the subtheme of employment, subtheme of macroeconomic performance. I'm sorry, let me take a second to point out. Most of you should have note cards. We're going to stop at the end to take questions. So it's going to be a lot of data over the next hour and a half or so. Please write your, I really want to see your questions and comments on this effort. So please take notes, write your questions down, and we'll be collecting those cards at the end. So again, three subthemes here: employment, macroeconomic performance, and earnings. Under employment status as an indicator, we looked at this idea that we should have more collaboration between the universities, the community colleges, school districts, the major employers, and support from the city, of course, to develop things like apprenticeship programs, to utilize STEM-type training programs. You know, again, the NAS workshop showed that we don't collaborate as efficiently and effectively as we ought to in Houston. So we think sitting down, you know, we got the universities again and the jobs to sit down at the table where we can cater programs to the jobs that are being developed in the city. It would go well towards alleviating a lot of the economic interest in the city. Under the subtheme of macroeconomic performance, we looked at primary jobs and green jobs. Primary jobs are those that attract primary capital into the local area, and so they happen to be primarily, not exclusively, but primarily manufacturing jobs. We also looked at the fact that we have the largest medical center in the world, and we attract patients and research technologists from all over the world as well. And so that is also a primary driver of capital coming into the local area. So under our metric for primary jobs, we included manufacturing jobs and healthcare jobs. And we looked at green jobs, since we would like to get to the point where each job is a green job. And I can address that definition when we get into that particular metric in the middle of the study. And so we looked at developing an alternative energy industry here in Houston. We are the petrochemical center, and so let's take advantage of the vast area that we have, the wonderful port that we have, access to water and land to develop an alternative energy industry here in the city and be ahead of the curve in that area. Let's look at developing IT and advanced technologies as well. I'm pleased to note that we have a green icon next to macroeconomic performance in Houston. And so we're talking about things that can add to that and maintain our stance and compare it to other cities, of course, and also to help us intrinsically. Let's look at continuing to improve, quality of life. The wonderful bonds that you guys just approved will go a long way towards that. Let's look at fostering growth in life science and biotechnology as well in Houston. These are things that we can lead the nation in terms of developing. Under the indicator income, let's foster again the development of energy trading, one of those things that we have an edge on. It would mean a collaboration between the partnership, banks, and universities, again, getting universities to the table to talk to business in terms of catering not just academic pursuits, but academic pursuits that matter. Let's look at developing opportunities to increase international trade based on our diversity. When I get into the numbers, you'll know that Houston is an increasingly more diverse city, and we have people coming from all types of countries. They can perhaps help us to form more trade across the world. We also looked at the indicator of waste generation and energy. Under waste generation, we have an issue in terms of requiring waste haulers to report sources of waste collected. Public agencies do not know where waste is collected from. They know what is collected and they know how much is collected. And in that regard, we cannot have good policy to be able to incentivize beginning users to reduce waste. Let's look at being more conscious about decreasing landfill space. Let's look at expanding the household recycling program to all households in the city. Under energy consumption, let's look at utilizing efficient building technologies, such as smart meters, which I think we have already. Let's look at educating and incentivizing residents to have more weatherization and energy conservation. Let's look at developing real-time pricing policies, since we have those smart meters in place. And let's look at energy disclosure policies and required audits for the big energy users. So those are some of the, again, things that we talked about in the economic development workshop. Here are a few more. We talked about transportation. It was a major discussion that we had, and it was great that we had the head of the largest transit service sitting at the table, and he was able to inform us that they are at the point where they're redoing the entire, looking at the entire service that of buses that we have in the city to redo routes and frequency. So we know that a lot of these things are being acted on presently by Metro. But under access to transit, we looked at kind of 4 different things. We looked at transit service improvements, accessibility improvements, transit coordination, and transit planning. Under improvements, we looked at travel time, of course, needs to be improved. And it can be done so by increasing frequency, circulation service, and linkages. Again, Metro is presently embarking on this challenge. Let's look at accessibility improvements, and that's improving such things as ramps, sidewalks, potholes, bridges, etc., so that citizens can get to those places to take the transit, because if they can't get to the bus stop, they're not going to take it. And so this is part of that complete trips package that should be done. And again, it's going to be based on collaboration with Metro and other public agencies. And that's where we get into transit coordination. I understand that HIC might have more buses than Metro does. And so how can we coordinate between HIC, Metro, the planning department, and Public Works to be able to coordinate access to transit for Houstonians? There's also this mention of the transit corridor ordinance that we have in place not being efficiently utilized. Under the sub-theme of demand, we have the indicator vehicle miles traveled, and we're talking about incentivizing housing development near to employment centers so that we can reduce the distance that folks have to travel to get to work. We also looked at having flex work programs implemented more efficiently and utilized as well. And under the sub-theme of mode, in terms of the travel choice, whether you're going to go to work by car or bus or rail or some other method, we looked at the idea that pedestrian and bicycle networks need to be developed along with rail networks and the overhauling of the bus routes. And we should also develop technologies such as apps to be able to help citizens be able to identify the best trip choices to get to their final destinations. So those are, that's a quick recap from the social and the economic sessions that we had. I'm now going to hand the presentation over to Jim Blackburn. Jim Blackburn is, when I was studying, a professor introduced this name to me as one of the stalwarts for environmental advocacy in Houston. In fact, not one of them, but the stalwart. And so Jim is a big advocate. He's been doing this for a long time. So I couldn't present the outcome of this workshop with Jim sitting here. So he'll do it himself.
I think John and Tom are here that were part of that group, and I invite them to join in and to offer critiques of what I'm saying, because frankly our conversation was somewhat far-ranging and probably spent less time on policy and more on indicators and more on some of the specific issues. Our purpose was to develop a consensus on the categorization of the indicators to determine suitable targets, exactly what we were trying to measure, and to develop policies and programs relative to the indicators. And I'd say we spent a little bit less time on that and more on some of the first part. We talked about air quality and greenhouse gas emissions under climate change under the atmospheric subcategory. We talked about water quality, water demand, and water resources under freshwater, and land cover and jobs housing balance, and I think that flooding has been added since then, if I'm not mistaken, which was not part of the presentation we had when we originally went over it, and we all thought it was a very important indicator for sustainability for Houston. I would tell you one of the big issues that we all kind of were concerned about is while I think with regard to particularly social and economic indicators, the city limit boundaries make perfect sense in terms of, if you will, the area within which we measure and determine the metrics. With some of these environmental indicators, the city limits was really probably less desirable as a boundary, but nonetheless it's what Lester had set up and was working with. And one of the things I'll flag for you is different areas where we think that didn't make a lot of sense. For example, ecological issues. Within the city of Houston, 640 square miles, there's not a lot of ecological issues left. For the most part, the ecology is in pretty bad shape. Now, the bayou system itself is probably the central ecosystem we have to work with, and I think we all came to a consensus that open space is probably more important than any type of ecological indicator. The ecological issues are much more at the regional level where we began to pick them up, where we've got the remnants of a lot of these natural systems that we have had, and frankly, the biological diversity around the city of Houston is among the richest in the United States. So it's a fabulous attribute. It's just less evident within the city boundaries. From an air quality standpoint, I think the extensiveness of the monitors is a major issue. The east side of Harris County, the east side of the city of Houston is very well monitored. As you move to the west, it's much less well monitored. And certainly if you go to outlying counties, it's almost non-existent. Probably has to do with some of the politics of the original designation of air quality non-attainment areas, actually. We believe that a mobility plan is necessary, that we need to think in terms of regional transportation, and certainly the idea of everything kind of coming through the city and combining with, if you will, the industrial air quality and our vehicular traffic to have the commercial freight traffic mixed in there probably doesn't make a lot of sense. And there was some discussion about the fact that we are, as a community, as a region, absorbing a load for the entire country. I think this is probably evident both with regard to climate change as well as to atmospheric emissions. That, on the other hand, is that big positive on economic development translates into a big negative with regard to both air quality and climate change related emissions. But nonetheless, there was some discussion about this issue. Climate change, we think it's absolutely essential that climate change be incorporated into the data gathering and record keeping. We think that a climate vulnerability assessment is very much necessary. I would tell you that we are extremely vulnerable to severe storm events in all sorts of ways. And if you notice what's happening in Memorial Park right now, we're basically going through and taking out the trees that died during the last drought, which was unprecedented as far as anybody I know can attest to. So we think that climate vulnerability is an extremely important issue, not adequately addressed. With regard to surface water quality, monitoring and particularly enforcement we think is lacking. The water quality data that was collected was primarily within the city of Houston, which is primarily the bayou system. And while that's certainly important if you're canoeing down Buffalo Bayou or happen to fall into one of the bayous, it's probably not what most of us encounter with regard to water quality. And certainly to the extent that the water quality was attempted to be linked to drinking water, we're not really drinking the water for the most part that comes through the bayou system. We may have yet a recycle, reuse alternative that comes at the lower end of the bayous, but that's not there yet. Instead, the big issue is out in the outlying areas. This is Lake Houston. There's something like about 300 individual wastewater treatment plants that discharge into Lake Houston, and there's a tremendous concern about emerging pollutants. These are the pollutants that are not treated or removed in the wastewater treatment plants, and one would think that we're going to be seeing more and more about this issue with regard relative to wastewater discharge into Lake Houston. Certainly the city at this point is meeting its drinking water quality standards as they're set, but the emerging pollutants are not included in those drinking we're primarily talking about pharmaceuticals and other types of things that we ingest, pass through when we excrete, and the wastewater treatment plants are not designed to remove those. So that's the big concern. And I would tell you the Lake Houston watershed is the key on that. With regard to water demand, there wasn't a lot that we really kind of focused on with regard to water demand, but I think the thing that's sort of the scariest, we really don't have good data. There is not a set of data. I think June was very clear that the city doesn't have specific numbers for landscape usage. That's an issue. There's concern about St. Augustine lawns. There's a general consensus that we need to be focused on water conservation strategies. And I think there's a more general concern about surface water and its long-term availability. Right now, the city of Houston is in excellent shape with regard to water supply. The 1.8 billion acre feet, no, it's not acre feet. We ain't got that many acre feet. But we have a significant amount of water supply that is available, primarily from Lake Livingston and from the Trinity River system. But there is concern in the long term about the overall availability of surface water, primarily related to climate change. The long-term drought prospect is a huge issue, as well as recycle, reuse in the Dallas area. And also you've got demands of Galveston Bay, because Galveston Bay needs freshwater inflow. It needs about perhaps as much as 5 million acre feet of inflow per year. And if you're taking out most of the water coming down, you're going to have a significant impact on the bay system. Land cover, basically the ecological issues are primarily outside for the most part, and it's really an open space issue within the city that we thought was, and we certainly emphasize the open space acquisition policies. Flooding, the amount of flooding within the city is significant. On this diagram, it shows that the floodways cover about 46 square miles of the city of Houston. About 121 square miles is within the 100-year floodplain. It's about 25% of the city is either floodway or floodplain. It's significant, and those floodplains are growing, and so we're just all concerned that that's an issue. It's a hard metric to come up with as to exactly what you use as a metric, whether you try to equate it to some sort of loss in terms of amount of damage each year against gross domestic product of the region. It's hard to come up with a good metric, but certainly flooding is a huge issue. And I guess policy-wise, less flooding is better. Development codes are not robust enough from a livability standpoint. We read a lot of debate about walkability and how one would measure what the metric of walkability is. How, in fact, one defines that was something we both discussed a lot, and I would say disagreed on a fair amount and had no consensus coming out, but other than it was a hugely important issue. So much of our discussion was really on the metrics themselves and on the scale of the metrics, and I think policy-wise, I think it was almost a consensus across the board of the issues that we presented. They're all important and they all need to be addressed. Thank you very much.
Okay. So let's get into the metrics for these themes, sub-themes, and indicators. Again, it's going to be a lot of data, and I'm going to do my best to clarify certain issues which I think might come up as I go through the presentation. So under the sub-theme of population growth, it looks at the indicator, of course, of population growth, and you can see here how Houston is doing. I have on the left how Houston is doing, here compared to Harris County. You can kind of look at the slopes of the curves from this type of level of analysis. I'll get into a more enlarged version in a second. We also looked at education attainment and voter participation. The takeaways that I want you to look at here are this trend. We have an increasing population in both the city and the county. On this one, I want you to see that the growth between this 10-year segment is much higher than the previous 10 and the following 10, which is, and this is the growth period that we're in at this point. Harris County has a more even growth rate. These two, I know you can't see the data, I'll have an enlargement in a second. I want you to pay attention to this cross in terms of ethnicities and slash races that are occurring at the city level on this side and the county level on this side. City of Houston, we have 2.1 million people approximately. And this big jump, this second bar, is the growth that occurred between 1990 and 2000. It was on average 1.8% a year, which is approximately 30,000 or so people. Here we have the 2000 to 2010 growth, which is a lot less. And of course, since we are on a growth trend, we're projecting a 1.42, growth over between now and 2020 to occur in the city. Here we have the ethnicity cross or challenge in Houston. This purple slope is the Hispanic population, and you can see that at time zero, which is 1980, it was below 500,000 people, and here at 2020, we have almost 1 million people. And it looks like the white population growth is kind of decreasing at almost the same rate as the Hispanic population is increasing. And so that cross occurred between 1990 and 2000 in the city of Houston. So as of the 2010 census, we had 25.6 white in Houston, 23% black, and 43% Hispanic in the city. On the county, the cross occurred between 2004 and approximately 2006. So the county is also majority minority at this point. We also have here voter participation, which is 34% in 2010. So this is why we call for an increase in participation at the city level. I also wanted to mention here, in terms of education, the gap between graduation rates, and I also wanted you to take a look at the statistics on enrollment for HISD. This pointer is really hard to follow. I'm looking at the second set of numbers down on the page, and so you can see here that the HISD had a 74.3% completion rate. The white cohort group was 88% completion. The black was 73, and the Hispanic was 70% completion. The largest demographic had a lower completion. Look at the enrollment numbers. You can see that HISD had 202,000 students. 15,000 was the enrollment in terms of white population. Look at the Hispanic population enrollment in HISD. It's 125,000, and they had the lowest completion rate. So this is something that really should be addressed. Here's a chart that looks at one of the things that came out of the social workshop was, Lester, we need to know what's going on at the county level, right? It's not enough to show us what's going on at the city level. So they sent me back to the drawing board, and I ended up having to do some analysis to show the change in population that's occurring at the county level. The blue, it's hard to tell, but the blue is kind of the city outline. Okay, the red is the loss in population in general across the county. Those red areas are census tracts. And you can see that those are not happening only in the city, they're happening kind of evenly distributed across the county. Kind of. The dark green is the increasing, the census tracts that are increasing in population. And so those are mainly occurring on the outer edges. So everything that's red and amber or orange are census tracts that are losing population. The red ones are losing a lot faster. And you can see then that on the amber side, the east side of the city is losing a lot. So is the southwest side of the city kind of losing in parts. And then, of course, the southeast side is losing as well. This one looks at the white population loss, because we saw that decrease in numbers. So where are they leaving from? Where is this cohort group growing, and where is it decreasing? And so the red again shows where they're decreasing most heavily in numbers, and it's kind of telling to point out that it's not happening again at the city. Inside of the city level, it's kind of happening, again on the inner fringes or so of Houston, and these happen to be just outside of Houston. kind of spot areas. So everything that's red, orange, or tan are areas where we have white population decreases, not zero white population decreases. The red ones are decreasing in a lot faster than the orange ones are. And the green and the dark green are the areas of growth. So you can see that inside of the city, we still have areas of growth along the I-10 corridor, south of the city, kind of medical center, heading down to the south. Of course, outside of the city of Houston, we have growth in other areas as well. Okay. On this group of charts, we're looking at income inequality, poverty, and health coverage. Excuse me. On this particular chart, you can see this is the difference in median income with regards to the top 20%. This green bar, we're looking at the chart, the top left-hand chart. The green bar is the median income, and the lower purple bar is the lower 20%. What's telling about this is that the median income is increasing steadily, but you can see with this upper 20%, and it's unfortunate I can't move around, this peak that occurred in 2000 shows that Houston was on a really awesome trajectory of growth, right? In fact, all three sectors are growing. In fact, by 2010, the median and the lower are still growing. But look at what's happening. The upper 20% stopped growing, of course. So this economy really hit the top 20% worse, right? Did it do anything to the median? It didn't, at least not according to the data. And this kind of shows that this 20% is probably really small compared to the median and the lower, because it had no discernible effect, on the median or the lower. In terms of the ratio share of income, we have a few numbers that show kind of the fact that the ratio share is actually decreasing. And this bottom left-hand chart shows that the percentage of poverty was 22%, we had 23%, living in poverty in Houston, and it's higher than we had in 2000 and also higher than we had in 1990. So the percent of people in poverty is increasing. Move on to the cost of living indicator under the livability theme. And I'll look at gasoline prices, I'll look at housing units as a percentage of income, and I'll look at food deserts and also access to parks. These numbers on the top left-hand side show the percentage of housing costs, Houston percentage of housing costs when compared to other municipalities, and also the housing and transportation together as a percentage of income when compared to other municipalities. As I mentioned earlier, when compared to these other, Houston is fourth largest city in the country in terms of both size and population. And so if we compare Houston, Chicago, New York, and LA, we see that Houston is 26th in the country in terms of housing costs as a percentage of income. So we're not the cheapest. But we are higher than New York and Chicago and LA. When it comes to adding housing and transportation costs as a percentage of income, you can see that New York happens to be third, right, with regards to, everybody knows about the high housing costs in New York. But they still happen to come out third because since they're so large, you have a wonderful cross-section of all kinds of things happening in New York. So there's also cheap housing and cheap transportation costs in New York. Chicago comes in number 14. Houston is number 26 in both measures. And LA comes in way down the list on 51. This particular group of numbers comes from the Center for Neighborhood Technology. And what I'm doing here is comparing the cities in the country that have more than 250,000 people. There are about 64 cities on that list, and it covered the entire country very well. We all have heard that, again, please write your questions and notes on the card, and I'll take them at the end, because I'm interested in your feedback. Here we have the median housing price when compared to gasoline price. You can ignore these numbers on the left of the chart. This is an index, so it's relatively trying to get them on the same scale. What we've heard is when the price of gasoline goes up, oh my goodness, housing cost is gonna go up, right? The builders are gonna charge more. But when we track the two together on a similar scale, we can see that as gasoline price, which is the red line, as the gasoline price increases or decreases, really didn't have any effect on the housing price. So arguably in the Houston area, housing price is not completely a function of gasoline price. It might have more to do with the speculative or arguably the demand or the value that consumers, place on housing. And so if somebody says, I'm not buying that house because it's overpriced and it's above the median, you might get a wife saying, no, I want that house, and we're gonna get it. So we have that happening in Houston with regards to the difference between the median housing price and the median gasoline price. Here we have a look at food deserts. This map showing an illustration of what are possibly food deserts in the city. We have no national standard on how to define food deserts. Most people agree that food deserts should be described as an area 1 mile or more from a supermarket selling fresh fruits and vegetables, if it's an urban area. If it's a rural area, they relax that to more like 10 miles. But then there's this issue of, should we consider a food desert to also be a high income or middle income neighborhood, or only a low income neighborhood? So should we be looking at housing value to determine what's a food desert? This research looks at all areas in the city that are more than 1 mile from a supermarket selling fresh fruits and vegetables. One federal agency actually only identifies supermarkets with more than $2 million worth of profits every year. And again, I relax that to any store selling fresh fruits and vegetables. So here's the distribution. The black areas are areas that are not 1 mile from a supermarket. Within the kind of circles, you can see some colors here, blue, green, again, tan going to yellow. The blue are areas that have housing values. I did track that, but it wasn't exclusive of other areas. So I wanted to show that our distribution of supermarkets is not exclusive of areas that only have higher valued housing. And in a sense, it's kind of telling that we may have supermarkets located in Houston that are serving lower areas, and there might necessarily have to be a more concerted effort to attract supermarkets in more distributed areas across the city. Because we have areas that have circles which are yellow. Yellow is where you have a median value of a house, which is $50,000 or $0 to $50,000. Here in the middle of the city is a black hole, which means no supermarket exists for this area within a mile. This is outside of a mile from the nearest supermarket. And that's the middle of our city. Here on just above, I guess along the I-10 corridor, just south of that, also some black. And here on the east side, also some black. So these are areas of prime concern because they're looking at the center of our city. Those are the metrics for the social development themes and sub-themes. And now I'd like to get into the economic development ones. So here we're looking at employment status, we're looking at primary jobs, green jobs, we're looking at income, wage generation, and energy use. In terms of unemployment, we had a 10% unemployment rate in 2010 at the city. You're going to see different numbers show up for what the unemployment rate was at 2010. This study uses the Census 2010 data, the decennial census, 2010 data, not the ACS data, and it's at the city level, not the metropolitan statistical area level. And the census reported that we had 10% unemployment, and of that, 6.2% was the white unemployment rate, the black unemployment rate was 16.5%, and the Hispanic rate was 9.5%. Let's take a look at that. So over this 20 years, we show that the unemployment rate for Houston, which was 10%, did increase, right? So some people argue it was because of the But what I wanted to look at was how it affected how unemployment or the loss of jobs, how vulnerable are the various ethnic and racial groups in the city. So the white population also suffered an increase, and it was 6.2%, a little bit below the average of 10. The African American ethnic racial group, excuse me, suffered a large increase of 16.5%. But look at where it was in 1990. And it actually decreased in 2000. I don't know if you guys remember that income inequality chart I showed that had a huge jump between 1990 and 2000. What this shows is that as a city does better in general, everybody actually enjoys that. So that's why we had that reduction. But when it does worse, these are the groups that are more vulnerable than other groups, which makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is why the minority groups are so disparate. Why is African American 16? Why is Hispanics 10? So I'm going to offer a hypothesis and bounce it off you guys. Hopefully, we can get some comments on that. And it is that what we have in the city is Hispanics, the larger number of Hispanics occupying middle to lower middle jobs, which happen to be service jobs, the restaurant jobs, the lawn maintenance jobs, and these things, though vulnerable, are probably those kind of necessities that we will continue to use. And so they weren't as much impacted by the economic downturn, whereas the African Americans may not be enjoying those types of jobs, and they were more vulnerable than other groups. Here we have the total jobs for the area, and the green and the red are the manufacturing jobs and health jobs, which we consider to be the primary jobs. Those jobs which bring new capital into the city, we want to increase those as a percentage of the total jobs, because then it shows how strong 1946, so to 64. So the eldest of the baby boomers must be 65 today, 66 today, right? 66 today. And so you would know that that is also a time of big suburbanization across the country. So between that and the advent of AC, we jumped from doing 1,000 kilowatt hours per year to increase that 15-fold today. Here is the energy demand of residential housing units, then compared to what HISD is using for their large institutions and the city administration is using. And you can see that the city and HISD use a small percentage when really compared to the households. So if we are going to have policy to address energy, it's really great that we have HISD and the city doing things for operations, but we also need to address the huge residential energy usage. This red and the blue is the difference between 2000 and 2010 across the city. And we're only looking at households here, by the way. I did not include commercial or industrial activity. And so that would have taken us above the chart, right? So we need policy to address household residential energy use in the city. And for the final theme under the economic development, the second pillar in sustainability here, we looked at transportation. We looked at transportation access, demand, and mode. This access to transportation shows that this huge chart, this huge bar, excuse me, on the right, top left on the right, shows that we have almost 100% of Houston with good access to a bus stop. And that we had a tremendous increase between 2000 and 2010. At this point, myself and the analysts at Metro, they're happy. But we're also kind of reviewing these numbers because they almost don't want to believe that it's true. And it's also a function of how we measure population here in terms of access to bus stops. You can measure access to bus stops in terms of a linear kind of Euclidean idea of, draw a straight line from my house to the bus stop. Or you can do it based on the road network getting to the bus stop. Or you can do it based on what is the road network and the distance from my house to the jobs. And that really should be, those would be more accurate, not necessarily more accurate, but those would be more robust measures of accessibility in Houston. In terms of annual vehicle miles traveled, in 2000 we were at 8,000 or so vehicle miles traveled per household. And a lot of you might be thinking, well, I don't drive 8,000 miles a year. you don't. But in general, our roads in Houston support commuters from outside of Houston. And so whereas Andrew Schneider reported that we're doing really well in jobs for the Houston area, it might not necessarily be telling for the city of Houston. And we carry a big burden in Houston for the outlying suburbs and other areas as well. And so that's driven our numbers up. It's also obviously caused more air pollution in the city, and of course the wear and tear of the road networks and highway networks across the city. We are bearing the burden for the suburban and outlying areas. In terms of alternative travel, this is decreasing over time. And what we're looking at is the percentage of people who are traveling to work alone in a car. And you can see, I'm sorry. This is the percentage of people who do not travel alone in a car to work. And it is decreasing over time. So more and more people are choosing cars over alternative travel. We think that obviously we should commend Metro and the city and county officials for approving these other 3 light rail lines. We think that will go a long way towards reducing the trend in these numbers. We will see. And so let's get into environmental development indicators. As Jim mentioned, one of the major things about this particular indicator is the fact that a lot of these themes not only affect the city, but they also affect the county and the region. And so air obviously isn't going to be stagnant, but how does it measure above your house? And does that mean anything? In terms of fresh water, how does the water quality coming out of your pipe affect you? And in terms of flooding, is your house in a floodplain or is it not? So these things are, please keep in mind, these things do have regional import, and they stem from sources outside of Houston, but they all will cross our homes every day. So the 2 charts at the top show ozone and PM 2.5. The one on the left, the black line, shows the federal standard for ozone, and you can see that Houston is above the federal standard, which means we're in non-attainment, but over time, it's actually decreasing. It's actually decreasing over time, and now it's kind of hovering along the federal standard. So we are in non-compliance for ozone. Out of the other federal standards for air, these are the only 2 that we should be paying attention to all of them, but these are the 2 that are challenging for Houston. In terms of PM, we are below the federal standard, so we are in attainment for PM, but we're just hovering there, so we should be mindful of these 2 as time goes on. The second 2 charts show CO2 emissions estimates. Let me do a blow up on these. So what you're looking at here is CO2 estimates for Harris County, not the city, but for Harris County. And we're looking at the difference based on generated sectors. So the largest number comes from the industrial sector. And then we have the on-road sector coming second, then electric producing, and we have residential being a minute amount. So whereas the residential was high in electricity when compared to others, when it comes to CO2, the industrial is way out of the list. We had 78 million tons approximately of CO2 equivalent being emitted in 2000. In Harris County, the author of this study, Kevin Gurney from the University of Arizona, is arguably the most prominent scientist in estimating CO2 equivalents in the country. And he's doing a wonderful survey called the Vulcan Project, which some of you might want to look at. He has a problem with properly estimating Houston. And so I pointed out to him that, first of all, his study reports out carbon, and a lot of people interpret it as CO2. So the big problem. But the other problem is comparing Houston to LA. And when he first put the survey out, he had Houston as the #1, and Harris County, as the #1, LA as #2. He then revised it and put LA as #1 and Houston as #2. I don't have 2008 data for the industrial emissions because they were so different than other years. I pointed out to Kevin, hey, what's going on here with the emissions? It showed that we had a major reduction in industrial emissions according to the Vulcan Project. And he did indeed say that they had a problem with the methodology, and it had to do obviously with getting data. We have an issue sometimes with getting data from private sources to be reported so that we can understand what's going on in our region. So I can only show you, he's only willing to stand next to his 2000 estimate of Harris County, which was at 45 million tons of CO2 back in 2000. As that data becomes available, he said 1 to 2 months, I'll include it in the study. Here we have water quality in terms of drinking water quality. We have the municipal demand for water in Harris County. We have also a look at the city versus county use of water, and we have water resources. So Houston is in compliance for all federal drinking water quality standards. But as Jim Blackburn pointed out, it's the stuff that they don't know about and the stuff that doesn't get measured that is an issue. There are no federal standards for these kind of emerging pollutants, the biotoxins, et cetera, the stuff that we're using on our skins every day, and medicines as well that go into surface water, which we're now using for drinking water primarily. We are at, in terms of water use, we're at about 165 gallons per person per day. This is a state-reported number. Another issue, again, that we have in the city, in terms of understanding how we're doing, is you know, as I said, reporting. So here you have a number that's reported by the state, and the City of Houston Water Department is kicking down my office door with the fact that this is not an accurate number for how well we are doing, and they have more accurate numbers. So they argue the state numbers are wrong because they're mainly based on projections, and they're taking our data. However, the data they're using is not reported the same way over time. So the methodology for 2010 is different than the methodology for 2000. So this is ongoing data management, which is, again, another reason why sustainability indicators type database would help for citizens, decision makers, and elected officials, because we have in one place data on how well the city is doing, and we can understand the differences and the discrepancies in terms of reporting agencies. In terms of water resources, Houston has access rights to 300 acre feet, Houston has dedicated 300 acre feet per year to the Galveston Bay, which means that this effluent that's coming out of the waste treatment plants will not be used or will not be taken back up and will actually get into Galveston Bay to stop other issues for sustainability, to prevent, other issues for sustainability. In terms of land, environmental development, this is the final selection of, I know you guys are tired, this is the final selection of information. So let's look at these three maps without further ado. The one on the top left is flooding and the increase in floodplain. The one on the top right is the land classification in terms of, similar to ecosystem. And the one on the bottom is the jobs and housing balance. This one shows the increase in the floodplain in the city of Houston when compared to Harris County. City of Houston outline is the area in black. And you can see that the green is the 100-year floodplain. The green throughout is the 100-year floodplain for the county. The blue is the 100-year floodplain for the city. And the orange kind of behind the blue is the change in the floodplain. So here in the southwest of the city is an area of prime concern. Also, the northwest looks kind of strange along the 290 corridor, in my estimate. What we have is, as Jim correctly pointed out in his previous study, it's about a quarter of the city in the floodplain. That is the equivalent to approximately, when I did the measurement, it's approximately 150 or so thousand housing units that are in that area of the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain to date. And I estimated the value of the homes that are in that area. This is a very simple estimate. And what I did was to look at the median value of homes in the city. And we know that, median value of homes was like 140,000 approximately, less than that. Most of the people in this room, your homes are not that cost, they're more. But this estimate gave me $18.5 billion value for those homes, which is money that would this is interesting. It brings me to another point, and since I'm closing, I'm going to allow myself to digress a bit. If we what we're going to see coming out of national GDP numbers in the first quarter first quarter of 2013 is an increase in GDP. And that's going to be as a result of Hurricane Sandy cleanup costs. If the GDP increases because we're spending money on hazard cleanup, that is not a good metric for sustainability because it's money that could have been used for more productive purposes. If we had a major storm, again, another Allison, and that heaven forbid, we suffer $18.5 billion of losses, we're going to show a jump in GDP for the city. But it's not necessarily a good measure, again, of economic success because that money could have been used differently. And so we should be concerned about this $18.5 billion, and one of the policies was to radically increase the amount of land in the floodplain that gets converted to open space and floodway, not housing. Under the second metric, land cover change, we have 78% of the city considered urbanized. Only 16% is high intensity development, which is apartment complexes, commercial areas, strip centers, etc. And then 46% of our city, half of it, is medium to low intensity development, which is our quarter-acre lots for the most part that make up half of the city. But 78% of it is urbanized. And so this is probably not a good trend for sustainability, although it's hard to understand how we can reverse it, except to acquire more green space and open space in the city. Here, the final chart is a look at the sub-centers, the job centers in the city. And we have 17 or so job centers in the city. The blue are areas that have, I know you can't read that, but it's areas that have 75 to 105,000 or so jobs in close proximity. The unit of analysis here was a transportation assessment zone. Any such areas that are closely aggregated and have more than 10,000 jobs meet the threshold of a job center. These blues are downtown Medical Center and uptown Galleria. The orange ones are Fairbanks going up to Beltway 8. Then we have the 290, I-10, I'm sorry, the 610, 290 kind of intersection is another one. We have Memorial City, we have the new energy corridor. We have the entire Southwest Freeway corridor actually looks like as low rise as it is, it looks like a burgeoning employment kind of center. And we have a new one here, which is emerging at the 610 and 45 intersection at the Gulfgate Mall. What this shows, when we looked at this compared to jobs and the availability of all jobs, we found that 50%, 57% of jobs were in the business centers, which isn't bad. It's about half. But if we didn't better to increase that, again, we would reduce transportation, which leads to air pollution issues. But we found that only 22% of the population were living a quarter mile from the business centers. So that's a look at the study. What I'd like to present to you is the next steps here, really quickly. Public presentation here. Policy and program recommendations, which will come out upon a consensus by the experts. And that's going to be a nice effort, as you can imagine. These wonderful people agreeing on the numbers. I'm also going to look at a national comparison. A lot of folks want to understand how Houston is doing with regards to when compared to other cities. Not necessarily that we shouldn't, we have a 25%, 30% voting rate and everybody else is doing 16%. We shouldn't rest on our laurels or anything, but we want to know how well our policy is doing with regards to when compared to others. And we'll also look at a neighborhood comparison. So we'll compare, what you saw here was the city of Houston and how Houston is doing. Next, we're going to look at how neighborhoods in Houston and areas in Houston are doing when compared to other neighborhoods. This effort I'd like to consider as Indicators 3.0. Indicators 1.0 was an effort mainly by national governments to identify what are indicators, to identify what are kind of the policy, to make an assessment as to how capable governments were in terms of being able to manage indicator sets. And so that effort was, again, mainly led by national governments. The second effort was more of local governments and cities and consultants. A lot of consultants mainly got into the second Indicators 2.0. And the product for Indicators 2.0 was, again, thousands of indicators out there. Siemens has an indicator database online. McKinsey does, so does IBM. And more recently, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, came up with a STAR Indicators database. And they're offering local governments thousands of indicators that they can choose from to be able to measure what's going on in their cities. I'd like to consider my work to be Indicators 3.0, and it's following kind of the work that Michael Newman from Texas A&M is introducing. He's now at University of South Wales in Australia. He's working with a chemical engineer, and they're looking at entropy and trying to measure and model what entropy would mean to make an assessment for sustainability, right? So we're not so much focused on what's the ideal, the ideal formula for an indicator. I need to find this holy grail so that when I get this measure, we win, right? We're moving past that. We're looking at the connections between the indicators. We're looking at how to properly understand why sustainability when compared to historical types of measures. So I'm going to give you a quick taste of, a quick review of an effort I did for comparing Houston to other cities in the country. I think I showed you earlier the housing transportation. Again, I took this 64 cities and I compared 27 indicators across those cities to identify correlations. And after identifying the correlations, I was able to measure the cities according to these correlated components that came out. And so the result of this was, I think, a valid assessment of groups of cities when compared to other cities and across certain indicators, not just one indicator or the whole group. So it's not an index as such, but it's exploratory research. So this one is based on a procedure. It's saying, I don't really care what indicators you use, but I want you to use a procedure that's a sustainability procedure. So this procedure has a normative component, which means the decision makers get to sit down and decide what goes in. It has a systematic component, which means the decision makers step back and let the computer and the analysts determine what comes out. And then an evaluation component at the end where we can actually decide what we have. So it's a lot of room for understanding new information coming out of this model. Here are the indicators I used for this particular effort. Looked at median real estate tax across the cities, national priority listed sites, percentage of vacant housing units. Again, you can see the list for yourself, but what I want you to recognize is this balance of indicators between the three pillars. It's an effort to ensure that if we get this balance, then it's a more sustainability procedure than previous socioeconomic studies. Here's the methodology for the correlation of the indicators. I have to toss out the MPL listed sites and the change in land area because those weren't very correlated across the 64 cities in the index. And here is the aggregation of the indicators. What I want you to take away from this is that when you compare the largest 64 cities across the country, according to those 27 indicators which I presented earlier, minus the MPL and the change in land area, we have the percentage of workers taking transit correlating very strongly with the walk index, which is an index of how much walking is done, correlating with the density of the population, with the average travel time, and LEED. Look at that, LEED buildings. So these measures show that cities are aggregating across these measures. And if we look at how cities compare across these measures, it can tell us that they should be in a group. And what does this group mean, right? So I called it the dense urban areas, for lack of a better name. It's called the dense urban areas. The second group is looking at auto sales when compared to gasoline sales, residential energy. So we're looking at driving, right? Energy, large population change, looking at so I call it the growth areas. I didn't want to call it the sprawl areas, right? Because in many suburbs today, we have suburbs that are becoming more dense. So sprawl is a tricky thing as well to put your fingers around. So I call it the growth areas. These areas that have a lot of driving, they're large, and that's what it is. The third one is this correlation between areas that have lots of workers over 16, right? But you can see here, there's a minus next to the K through 12 population, which means these areas don't have a lot of school-age population. The third one is they have lots of graduates, high percentage of white workers, and a low percentage of unemployed. What would you call this group of indicators, or this group of cities? We call it the professional kind of cities, for lack of a better term, right? We can decide on the name for that. And then the fourth one had high medium housing value, high median income, low vacant housing again, and medium real estate taxes. I call that the stable real estate, for lack of a better name. Now, these four different groups, the indicators within that group compared more strongly with those other indicators than other indicators across the other groups. And so here is how it looks when you rank the cities in the country according to these groups. This is the national effort. I'm going to do the same the procedure for the local areas in Houston. So what you have here, when I invite you guys back in the spring, is a look at how neighborhoods in the city compare with each other when compared to correlations of indicators in the city. And so again, we think this is more, I think this is more of a sustainability type assessment than a traditional socioeconomic assessment, you know. So it's showing that when it comes to the densities, right? Whenever I see New York showing up at the top of something like this, I always say, oh yes, the model works, right? and Houston is at the bottom, but it's not the last. It's actually number 23. Maybe I should change that so it's clear. But Fort Worth is at the bottom when it comes to dense, which is strange because Fort Worth was actually the largest. Fort Worth added the most jobs between the most people between 2000 and 2010 when compared to other cities in the country. They added over 200,000 people. But it's very not dense. So what I take away from this first one is that Houston is not performing like other large cities in the country, the New York, LA, and Chicago. And so decision makers should pay attention to that. What are the things that make these cities show up at the top? Why don't we have those things in Houston? So if you go back, percentage of workers who take transit, right? It was low in Houston. Walking index, low in Houston. Density, low in Houston. The mean travel time, so we are about average, approximately. It's not that bad in Houston. LEED buildings, maybe we could improve, even though we report a lot of LEED square footage. But the first three are clearly not doing well for us. The second one, the growth cities. New York is at the top. Look at where Houston is, right? We are growing. So these are the things that we're doing well in. Auto sales, gas station sales. That's not funny, but yeah, right. So Detroit is at the bottom. When I see something like this where Detroit is at the bottom, yeah, the model works. Model works. So the third one, professional cities, right? So where does Houston fall? 28th in terms of professional cities. So we're a mixed city. You know, we don't want to necessarily be at the top because for these ones, professional cities mean that we don't have a big school-age population, and the unemployment rate should be definitely increased in Houston. And we know that we're not 3/4 white. So we can't be high on this, but we could increase those people with graduate degrees in the city, and we should probably want to attract more workers as well and reduce our unemployment rate. And in terms of stable real estate, Houston is actually 38, according to these 64 cities, so we're not that stable. Once more, we can look at what that means. The household income should be higher. The housing value could be higher. We might have too many vacant housing units. For the 2010 census, we actually had 100,000 vacant housing units in the city. And again, I showed that we're only growing at 30,000 people a year. So arguably, it's an argument, you know, should we be increasing housing building in the city if we have 100,000 vacant units and we can only fill a third of them in a year? It's an argument. We because what we do want to do is increase walkability and livability, so we might want to build differently. And then there's that median real estate tax. So that's a quick look at analysis that goes into the next segment of this project. I'd like to end by just presenting to you takeaways. This is an effort to take big data, right? This is an effort to encourage cities, decision makers, other agencies to take big data. Don't be scared about big data. Put it in the soup bowl, if you will, and let's see what comes out of it. What can it tell us? Make it a sustainability effort. Include a balance between the social, economic, and the environmental indicators. We cannot just report on socioeconomic data. It's not enough to just talk about the economics or our population growth. We have to increase the use of environmental data as well. The research shows, again, how sustainability can meet this understanding, how to target investment for various functions of government. Again, looking at the correlations of the indicators can help us with that. How systems are interrelated, and how to categorize and compare various areas, and who should we be comparing ourselves to when we want to look at how well we're doing. Thank you very much for your time today. I'd like to end by collecting your comment cards for questions and comments. Right, so the Shell Center for Sustainability will post the final report on December 21st. What we're trying to think of is a way to also be able to integrate, again, your comments and your concerns and your questions, a way that you could follow real-time data, and also a way that we can have the indicators updated periodically to reflect the changes that go on in the city. So that's an upcoming effort as well. So you should see the final report on after the 21st of December, just in time for the holidays, in case anybody wanted to do some light reading. Okay, so this question is saying, according to the Environmental Working Group, we are not in compliance with water standards. Additionally, we are expanding to a greater number of trace pollutants than any other major city. So what this question gets to is something that came up with our expert working group. When we talk about water quality, there's a difference between drinking water quality and surface water quality. So the drinking water quality will probably cover what comes out of your tap, and the surface water quality is what happens in the bayous, etc. So Jun Chang is right. We are in compliance with all federal standards, and the City of Houston is doing everything they can to meet those federal standards. The problem is that we can't monitor, we cannot monitor pollutants that have no federal standards. What this group actually found was, and I'm glad I had a chance to review this before I got the question. What this group found is that we had 146 or so pollutants showing up in our water. Those were all addressed, actually. I'm sorry. Most of them were addressed if they covered federal standards, but if they didn't, then the city had no way no technology to be able to address those concerns. I think what another takeaway is that because we're moving from groundwater to surface water, and the reason why we're doing that is because we have land subsidence issues in Houston. Groundwater tends to be cleaner than surface water, and so surface water is going to get all kinds of contaminants from atmospheric pollutants, from effluent, from your dog going to the bathroom, or too close to Lake Houston, for instance. This could be an issue. And however, the city is doing all they can to clean that up before it gets to your tap as much as possible. Yes, we all know the bayous could do a lot more cleaning. And as Jim mentioned, the problem there is not having enough monitors or enforcement standards to monitor the waste treatment plants. And so that is one of the policies that we identified is increasing our ability to do that. Okay, so this is a question here about population growth. Is growth sustainable, or should we be talking about density? So I love these questions because again we get to present other issues in sustainability. So traditionally we had the first population scares end of time kind of predictions that the world is going to increase, and because of population growth, we're all going to be doomed, right? The math hard kind of efforts. That goes along with this idea of indicators 1.0. It's the same kind of idea. It spurred a whole movement, and actually spurred the Brundtland Commission looking into it in terms of what are we going to do? We have to measure population. What are we going to do? We're eating up everything. The second wave of understanding recognized that there's a difference between consumption for developed countries and consumption for developing countries, and that most of the population growth was actually happening in the developing countries, and they were consuming much less. So when you compare a country that has less population, less growth, to one that has more population, less growth, well, more population, more growth, you find that they're actually consuming similar, and in some cases less resources. So should we be advocating for population reductions in developing countries and encouraging population growth in developed countries? So this is an issue. So today, now we understand we have to rely on things like carbon footprint analyses and the like to determine whether or not we have the right population growth to meet our resource availability. What I presented was this idea that we have 100,000 vacant housing units and we're only growing at 30,000 people a year. So arguably we could accommodate that growth in our existing housing stock without doing any more building. So in that regard, Houston can do with more growth, right? I'm not willing to get into other explanations as to why more population growth is important, although we know that if we have less population growth, it doesn't just mean that we have less pollution and we have less strain on our water resources and our energy bill. It also means that you actually increase blight because you might have more vacant housing units. And then you have people who were smart enough to look at the census to say, well, I don't want to move to Houston because they're losing people. Look at what's happening to Detroit. A lot of it is the cold. Nobody wants to, maybe, I don't know. But again, there's this value system that we have, which also, which is why if we use the model that says there's a normative component and a systematic component, we get to integrate these kind of concerns. And so yes, there is a question about population growth, but this study shows that at least on one indicator, on one regard, we can accommodate the population growth, a larger one. Food deserts does not reflect multiple new grocery stores in the Heights and Montrose area. So the data that we collected was at 1990 point, the 2000 point, and 2010 point. And I used a commercial source to identify stores. And what I looked at was this database that showed stores that had more than, I used a number of employees, 10 to 15 employees at the minimum threshold to be able to separate, 50 employees, to be able to separate between what were gas stations and corner stores, these little stores, for larger stores. Understanding that larger stores will carry more of an assortment of groceries. I did use groceries as opposed to pharmacies and gas stations. I looked at separating between the two in the database. So it doesn't capture new stores after 2010. But we know that Houston signed a deal to bring a store downtown more recently. It cost us a couple dollars, but arguably it's a good, forget about the details of how it got there. It's good that we have a grocery store downtown today. And we should do more of that. We should have more public-private partnerships to increase the things that we need to do for Houston. And in terms of activities planned within the next year for these indicators, as I presented, the first report goes up on the 21st. In the spring, we're going to have the neighborhood level analysis, and we'll have a second public presentation and a second report coming out as well for that. And between now and also the spring, we hope to put out a consensus document from experts in the field with regards to policies and programs that we should be looking at to improve sustainability of the indicators in Houston. What was my biggest surprise? Okay. So the biggest surprise, it wasn't a surprise, it was, well, I guess, to be honest, my biggest surprise was that we didn't have more green in the city. So I was a little bit reluctant to put those icons up there. You know, most of what you see in the media about how Houston is doing is great, right? You see the Forbes report saying we're #1. And so it's kind of strange to put a report out with such negative icons. So that was surprising to me. One thing that was also, that I realized as I was doing this is that, you know, after collecting mounds and mounds of data, is that we are a wealthy city. We are a rich city. We have a lot of people. And in that regard, we can afford to do things in Houston. So if it means we are running out of water, we could probably find money to bring water in from someplace else. Or we could float some bonds, right? So it's a matter of priority in terms of what we do here in the city. How do we get to priority? Well, our decision makers put it out to you guys. And they say, let's do a bond, right? So how do we get to the point where you get something on a bond? And I think most of you guys know how that works in the city, because you know, I can see that the room is filled with people who understand that effort. So our decision makers like this reliable procedure that if the citizens in Houston want something, they'll advocate for it, and it will come up on a bond. But in that regard, there's, in my opinion, a separation of institutions here where we have our deed restrictions and our home ownership associations, which a lot of us serve on, and we do things to protect our neighborhoods. And we don't really, outside of advocacy groups, we don't really do things to hold our elected officials engaged. And I believe what Mayor Brown wanted to do was to bridge that gap by creating the super neighborhoods, where your neighborhood associations would come together as an aggregate and come up with policy in terms of what you wanted done, and take that to city council through capital improvements. But there are 88 super neighborhoods in the city, and they don't all have boards, which means some people aren't interested in being a part of that effort. And some people really don't understand how it's supposed to work. And then there are other questions about the borders of the super neighborhood, and other questions about, well, I really don't have a relationship with that other neighborhood on the other side of the highway, right? It's too hard for me to get there. So it's this question of maybe changing the way we have reliably relied on advancing our needs and wants in the city to the decision-making body. And I'm not saying the decision-making body is at fault here. I think we all need to hold each other accountable for addressing that concern and building bridges between what we think the city needs to do, how we need to spend our money, and how it gets done. So there's no, I don't think, easy answer, except that we should all hold ourselves accountable. Who do we see as the biggest users of data? I think that the biggest users of this data, again, is supposed to be citizens, decision makers, and elected officials. I've gone down to city council and I've met with 2 city council representatives, 2 of your elected officials, and they're interested. They're interested in the second part of the survey. They can then take into lobby with regards to, hey, here's how my neighborhood is doing, and you know, maybe we can make these changes, or maybe we don't want to make these changes. But again, as a research institution, we can offer the research, and if anyone is interested, we can make it available to them. The other thing research institutions can do is to be advocacy organizations. And that in itself is a tricky medium, because we like to be considered impartial. So we prefer to step back and be the kind of purveyors of the data, and to quietly maybe knock on somebody's door to say, hey, take a second look at this, if you will. So we can't really predict who the end user, the biggest users are going to be, but we do have some plans in place to take it to city council. Okay, so there's a question here about the parks access. So for parks, I use city-owned parks only. And Joe Turner likes to say, well, you know, if you include the state parks and the county parks, you know, you're going to have a lot more parks, which is true. But I don't want to take Joe Turner off the hook for making more city-owned parks available in the city. And so again, Houston cannot be responsible for advocating for the state to buy parkland in the city or the county, but they can advocate for making an increased budget, increased segment of the budget for the city of Houston to do more parks here. The reason why we're doing Houston as opposed to the county or the region is because you all are familiar with how the counties and the regions are doing, but very few public agencies put out data on Houston. Very few public agencies collect primary data on Houston. Most of them rely on regional analyses and federal analyses. And so why is that, right? Is it a historical trend? And it probably is. It's just the way we've done business. But we need to understand how Houston is doing, especially when we're doing differently than the county, especially when we're in danger of losing people to the county, losing major businesses to county areas. We need to understand how well Houston is doing. Why not a breakout of Asian Americans when you look at African Americans, Hispanic, and white data? The Asian American population is not growing as fast, and they're very small when compared to Hispanic and Black and white populations. So what, the person could have asked, well, why did you include Black if there was so much less than the white population, right? So the reason why, so if you look at the other, it's so much below. So Asian Americans actually fall into that other. So it's a very minute number, right? The big thing here is the Black and the white and the Hispanic. So why did I put the Black in there at all? Well, because it does cross. You see a population change there for the city when it comes to African American and Hispanic between 1980 and 1990. And you also see this trend of white population going as far down as African American population coming closer to 2010. So that's why these three were included. Don't want to include everything, trying to make this as parsimonious as possible. And for that reason, I stand, I have to shoulder that omission, except that what I'd like to preface is it didn't really, including Asian Americans would not have changed the main focus of this particular indicator. In terms of jobs, why the emphasis on energy trading? You point to healthcare and manufacturing as most desired. What about technology transfer from healthcare? That's the economic development policy that looked at the things we can do to improve jobs and also employment status. So actually this developing IT and advanced technology skills is both for healthcare and IT in general. And then the last point, the life science and biotech was for healthcare. So the experts, I think, chose this one in particular. I actually know quite a few postdocs from other countries coming here to do research in the medical center from all over the world. So life science and biotech industries is considered healthcare related. Okay, we talk about sustainability. Can local government policies that place a result on positive trends and themes without continuing negative trends in the environment? Okay, so again, I like these questions. I had to read it 3 or 4 times, but this is a good point for me to talk about a major source of concern among the experts with regards to including a metric on street intersection density here for the environmental side of things. So most people on the socioeconomic side understand that most people on the socioeconomic side would like to think that if we increase street intersection density, then we actually increase walkability and we increase density, and we have to do that if we're going to grow as a population. Otherwise, we will increase transportation. And from the expert consensus on the experts for the environmental workshop, they saw that as a major problem with regards to increasing roads. So here is a good example of a sustainability type metric and policies that go along with that to promote sustainability. The U.S. Green Building Council, through their Lead for Neighborhood Development, would like you to increase those intersection densities, to have your neighborhood meeting LEED standards. But yes, it will have an impact in terms of increasing pavement. Now, to mitigate that, there are some solutions. But again, just through the plain reading of it, you could argue it's going to increase pavement. But of course, again, just because you increase intersection density, it doesn't mean that you have to increase pavement, because you can have more porous paving rather than impervious paving. And you can also have the development of more trails that also act as intersections. And arguably, if you are going to have more of a population, you do have to end up building more networks for people, and it should alleviate transit. But as you can tell, with the omission of the street intersection density indicator, the environmental experts won that one, at least for this study. Someone would like to add that over the last 5 years, Metro's bus ridership dropped 35%. We need to take into account the difficulty in an extremely low density city to make an efficient transit system works, which is true, although from our history, the Main Street rail line is arguably the most used, the heavily used rail line per mile in the country. So there's a demand for rail in the city. Houston's touted affordability has become a myth and is probably getting worse. Affordability should be measured against median income wages. So we did that. And yes, again, that was the last question. We did that. We looked at comparing Houston to other cities. We looked at, in terms of affordability, doing housing value and against the median income, and also transportation costs. So I thank you guys for your time.